So let's talk about why and how to use ND filters on the Insta360 Ace Pro. So the first thing to know is, why should you use ND filters on your Ace Pro? What purpose do the ND filters accomplish? So to put it quite simply, ND filters allow you to get a slower shutter speed with your Ace Pro. The end goal is a slower shutter speed because a slower shutter speed looks more appealing in a lot of situations. A slower shutter speed allows more light into your camera, but on a bright sunny day like today, without ND filters, you can't achieve a slower shutter speed because there's too much light coming into your camera. And if you do a slower shutter speed, your footage is going to be overexposed and blown out. It's going to look basically entirely white. So using one of these ND filters right here allows you to let less light into your camera. So when you put one of these on your camera and let less light into it, you can slow the shutter speed to balance that out. When you slow the shutter speed, more light comes into your camera, you can get the proper exposure, and you can get footage with a slower shutter speed. Having that slower shutter speed is particularly useful if you want to get the 180-degree shutter angle in your footage. In other words, if you want to have your shutter speed twice your frames per second. For example, if you're filming in 30 frames per second, you'd want to have your shutter speed at 1/60 in order to fulfill that 180-degree shutter angle. But you don't just have to do the 180-degree shutter angle. A lot of times, if you just want to slow down your shutter speed somewhat for your videos, there's going to be more motion blur and it's going to look a lot better, but you don't have to slow it down quite that much. And another major use case for ND filters is if you're doing time lapses with your Ace Pro. When you do time lapses, if you don't have a slow enough shutter speed, the frames are going to look really sharp and jagged, and it's not going to flow properly. And one of the goals with the time lapse is you want it to flow nice and smooth. It's going to look really good when it does. And if you put an ND filter on your camera when you're doing a time lapse, you can get that slower shutter speed, and each individual frame is going to have that nice motion blur with whatever's moving in your frame, whether that be water, clouds, or anything else. Next, let's talk about how to use ND filters with the Ace Pro. So first of all, the set that I use is this set of 4 right here. And I did buy this directly from Insta360, but you'll see down here, it is made by Freewell. They're not a cheaper plastic material, they're actually made of metal. And I feel like they're really rugged because of that. And this particular set comes with an ND8, an ND16, an ND32, and a polarizer. So these are some of the easiest ND filters I've ever installed on a camera. In this case, I'm going to select ND16. I feel like the lighting today is lighting that justifies ND16. And in order to install this, all you have to do is just pop this over top of the existing lens cover, and it pops right on. Turn the Ace Pro around so you can see it facing toward the camera. And it's very rugged on there. I've never had it fall off when I'm using the camera. It stays right on. That includes when I've been sledding with the camera and doing some other fast-paced action with the camera. Next, let's talk about the settings that you need to adjust on your Ace Pro in order to get the most out of the ND filters. I do have the ND16 filter attached right now. If I didn't have it attached, that's what the footage would look like. It would be pretty washed out and the screen would be hard to see. So I'm going to put the ND filter back on there. So the first settings I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you how to configure your camera for video footage. So I'm going to go to the standard video mode right there. You want to pick your resolution in frames per second. Right now I do have it set to 4K 60 in the 4:3 ratio with standard stabilization, but you of course can go all the way up to 8K 24 on here. You just have to set this to 16:9 for the ratio, and then you can select 8K there. So it doesn't really matter here because we're going to pretty much plug in the same settings. The only thing that's going to differ is the shutter speed if you're trying to do the 180-degree shutter angle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 8K 24, and we're going to swipe left. And when you start off here, you're probably going to have auto unless you've keyed in your own settings. And even if you have, you still may have auto there. But what we're going to do is we're going to go over here to M for manual. And there's some key settings we're going to put in here to get the most out of the ND filters. First of all, for the color mode, it doesn't really matter what you select there. I like to use flat because I like to add a little bit of color later on, saturate it a little more to my liking, but that won't affect the ND filter. The next setting here is a key one. This is shutter speed. So for shutter speed, it's probably going to start off at auto for you, but we want to use M, and we want to manually set the shutter speed. If you're doing the 180-degree shutter angle, right now with the frames per second of 24, I would want to set a shutter speed of 1/50. One thing to note is if your shutter speed is below about 1/200 or 1/240, if it's slower than that, you are going to get jitter and ghosting in your footage if you have stabilization turned on up here. If you're going to do that and use a shutter speed anywhere below 1/240, I recommend you turn off stabilization and you'll want to use a mechanical gimbal. This camera does have the freeform video mode where you can film footage with the stabilization off, and then you can put it into the Insta360 app later on and stabilize it. However, I tested it out. If the shutter speed is below that, it will not stabilize properly. So if you do decide to do the 180-degree shutter angle, you're going to need a mechanical gimbal. I'll link to a couple in the description below that I've used with this camera and had good results with. But I do want to make that clear because that is really important to know that you do have to have the gimbal if you go below about 1/240. So back to this setting, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set this for not using a gimbal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up here and I'm going to set it to 1/240 and I'm going to click right there. So the next setting we can do here is we can adjust the ISO. Now with the ISO, what that will do automatically is if you enter brighter light, it's going to lower your ISO all the way down to 100 if needed. But if you enter lower light, it's going to automatically boost your ISO up to whatever you set for the max value. So with the max value, I recommend setting it to 800 max, but I don't recommend going higher than 800 because there will be quite a bit of noise in your footage. And if the max needs to go higher than 800, then you probably want to use a stronger ND filter, in this case, ND32, because ND32 will filter out even more light. And you, of course, can also manually set the ISO if you would like to. So we could set this all the way down to 100, which if you look at that, 100 would be way underexposed and your footage would be too dark. Which, by the way, if you notice that and you want to set the static ISO, or if you want to have a little bit lower ISO, you can take this off and you could put on ND8, because what this means right here is ND16 is a little bit overkill. You don't need to have ND16 on right now because of the lighting. So I'm going to take ND16 off and I'm going to put ND8 on there. So when I put on ND8, you notice it's a little bit brighter at ISO 100, but it's still a little bit dark. So in this setting, if I was to manually set the ISO 200 right there looks about like the proper exposure. Maybe a little bit higher with ISO like 320. Or of course, we can go back and we can set the ISO range to click on auto and let's select 800 max. And then we're going to let the camera do the rest of the exposure. For EV comp, I recommend putting this at -0.5. It's still best to have footage that's not overexposed. You can always add a little bit of exposure boost later on when editing. For the final couple settings down here at the bottom, for the white balance, if you're filming in the daytime, I recommend 5000K or 5500K. 5000K is going to give a little bit cooler appearance to your footage. 5500K will be a little bit warmer. And then for the sharpness, I recommend keeping that at low. If you're going to edit later on, you can add a little sharpness. If you're not going to edit, I recommend medium right there. Medium is going to give you good results if you're not editing. Then once you've keyed in all those settings, you're good to go. It's going to give you a nice, smooth shutter speed when you're moving. There's not going to be a lot of sharpness to your frames, but setting it to 1/240 is going to give you the slowest shutter speed where you can also reliably get good footage with the flow state stabilization turned on without having ghosting and jitter. The next settings I'd like to go over with you is I'd like to look at the time-lapse settings. So we're going to go to time-lapse mode and we're going to key in those settings. So first of all, for the time-lapse, you can pick your different settings here. For shoot length, I like to use infinity. For interval, if it's a sunrise or sunset, I like to do 2 seconds. If it's during the day and you're doing a longer one, you can do 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Whichever interval you pick is fine. That won't affect the functionality of the ND filter unless you pick a really fast interval and you want to have a shutter speed of something like 1 second or higher than that. Your shutter speed has to be at least your interval or slower. So if I set an interval of 2 seconds with a shutter speed of 1 second, that's fine because the shutter is going to be open for 1 second and it gives it an additional second before it takes the next frame. So in this case, I'm going to put it to 2 seconds as if I'm filming a sunset. And then for stabilization up here, that doesn't really matter. I leave it off because I'm filming a time lapse and I'm going to have it on a tripod right here. So I don't need the stabilization turned on. For the ratio, I do like to do 4:3 because I can add some motion to my time lapse later on if I want to pan up or down. So we're then going to swipe down and we're going to swipe over. So the color mode, just like with video, that doesn't really matter for time lapse. You can pick whatever you want there. I like to pick flat because I like to do a little bit of editing later on to bring out some of the colors. For the shutter speed, in order to get a really good time lapse, I highly recommend setting a static value here, and that's going to help prevent flicker in your time lapse later on. I like to set values no faster than 1/60. So in this case, that's overexposed already right here. So I would need to take off ND8 and I'm going to put on ND32. You can see right there, it's really overexposed because 1/60 is a fairly slow shutter speed. But when I pop on the ND32 filter, you're going to notice it's a much more even and good exposure there. So I like to not go any faster than 1/60, but ideally, I like to take the shutter speed down even slower. So for time lapses, I often like to do about 1/10, 1/8, and if the conditions allow for it, I like to go down to 1 second even. Anything between 1/60 and 1 second gives a nice smooth flow to the time lapse. It looks really good. And if you're doing this, say at sunset, if the exposure is right when you're starting it and it's getting darker and darker, then your exposure is going to be fine the rest of the way through and it's going to fade to darkness. If it's during the day with really even lighting, you're going to be okay here too. So for the ISO, you've got a couple options here. You could set the ISOs to a static value if you want to. If the conditions are changing slightly during your time lapse, I like to put a little bit of a range here with the max. I usually like to do 500 max for time lapses because if it's a sunset one, as it gets dark, the camera's going to boost the ISO all the way up to 500 max, but then it's not going to go higher than that. If you have the ISO set to something higher for the max, it's going to keep boosting the ISO and it's going to kind of look weird with the sunset because it's not going to be an even fade to darkness. The ISO is going to keep cranking up and it's not going to be the right timing. So I recommend doing 500 max at most. But like I said, you can also set a static value. If you're going to, I recommend setting the static value 500 or below. And that's going to really help prevent that flicker in your time lapse. And then for the EV comp, for a time lapse, I do recommend going -0.5. It's going to help preserve a lot of those highlight details in the clouds. Even if you're not going to edit it later on, it's still going to look best with that -0.5. Now for white balance, since I'm setting this up as if I'm doing a sunset, I'm going to do 6500K for a sunset time lapse. But if you're doing a time lapse during the day, it's going to be just like the video mode. I recommend doing 5000K or 5500K. And finally, down here for the sharpness settings, I recommend setting the sharpness to low. Low is going to give you the best results with a time lapse. It's going to help every frame flow even more smoothly because it's not going to be over sharp. So recommend doing low for that. Once we've keyed in those settings, our time lapse is good to go and we're ready to start it. And it's going to keep going until you stop it. Speaking of ND filters, if you'd like to learn more about my favorite accessories, including these that I use for the Ace Pro, check out this video right here.